Given Mkhari from MSG Afrika, a very warm welcome. Now, 2 months ago, you launched Power FM. It was the newest radio station here in Gauteng. Where was the gap? And perhaps more importantly, how big was the risk?
The gap was in the lack of a post-94 fresh radio station that will talk to South Africans based on how they see themselves today and how they relate to contemporary South Africa, as well as how they see their future. The risk was in doing it right, because our view is that the listeners and the audience has always been ready for this type of a radio station. The question was, would we live up to it?
How difficult was it to set it up, both from a business perspective and also from a talent acquisition perspective?
Rejected by funders about 5 times. Took about 5 years from initial license submission to licensing. Attracting critical talent, competing with some of the established entities for talent, and infrastructure is infrastructure. And I guess the first few months has been to get all that conceptual work into real, something that is effective, something that people can relate to, and also getting all those big names to gel into one team, which is still work in progress.
It's the funding thing that is interesting. How did you convince those funders that you had a viable business proposition here?
Funders tend to look, they've got this big phrase of skin in the game. So initially we thought we'll go with 10% equity and then 20. We ended up with about 33% own equity that we put in there. So to the extent that we're prepared to risk our balance sheet and our own relatively low resource base into a startup. Secondly, quite frankly, none of the commercial banks were even prepared to look at it. In their view, they don't make a distinction between commercial radio, public service radio, and community radio. They're like, oh, too many radio stations. But couldn't see the overt and obvious gap that in the talk space and in commercial radio, there actually was nothing that will be talking to the majority of South Africans in the format that I think is the future. But fortunately, FDIs, both NEF and IDC, on the back of having pushed us on the equity side, we ultimately got them to back the business.
So take the business out of the media space. What advice would you give any young startup?
You sell yourself, to the extent that most of us are not operating in the resource space, or manufacturing is still challenged, operating in the knowledge economy. People tend to buy, what do they say, they back the jockey. And the extent to which a jockey will be backed will be how authoritative and how much of an expert are you in that which you're talking about. Because ultimately, it's a combination of your skills, expertise, your passion, and the extent to which you're prepared to go to back yourselves. And if you confidently back yourself, you are likely to back the idea that comes from yourself, and therefore can convince other people to back yourself. So the jockey is the business.
You've been, as I say, on air for about 8 weeks now. It's real early days, but can you look back so far and perhaps tell me what the biggest mistake you've made is so far?
The biggest mistake in a startup is to assume that the level of conviction and depth and passion will be shared from the person who cleans to the person who dirties the room. The truth is, you're lucky to keep that which was on paper and convert it into reality, and you need to be ready to forgive yourself. Yeah. And fortunately, the bulk of the members of the team have understood that we've had to make certain adjustments in a very short space of time. And I guess what helps is that at that stage, it hasn't gotten to a point where people feel it's personal, because it's early, so you haven't upset enough people to make personalized decisions. So we've had to make certain adjustments both on air and behind the scenes.
Passion is such a cliche in business, yet it is so critical. How do you infuse the passion that you're talking about on a day-to-day basis, particularly when a startup, and it's emblematic of a startup, is going to be making mistakes all the time, and people as a result of that will become demoralized?
I've come to learn that in any entrepreneurial business, if you don't, as the entrepreneur, don't lead by example, if they don't see you running those long hours, if they don't see you running around, if they don't see you excited, if they don't see you upset about something that goes wrong, if they don't see the intensity with which you take and the seriousness with which you take this thing, they go to chill town. So ultimately, passion in an entrepreneurial venture would come from the leadership of the organization, and with time, it then catches up with the rest of the team.
The other thing that you alluded to was having to make changes. I would imagine in any startup you've got to be able to make. You go in one direction, you say that's not working, I've got to change quickly. Often business people don't like to make that change because it's difficult, it requires courage.
And yet leadership is about, amongst other things, about adaptability. It's about being humble enough to say that which I had in mind is not working, and to be able to confront yourself without having to go through, ego issues about whether you may have missed the boat. So for me, being decisive is a critical character trait of a business person, and also being humble enough to say, I got it wrong, but I'm big enough to face it and deal with it.
Is there enough humility in South African business right now?
I would imagine that they should be. We talk about Ubuntu, don't we? For me, Ubuntu is not.
We talk about it, but we don't always practice it, do we?
I guess there's a difference between being apologetic and being humble, and I think humility is critical. But I don't think you can run and lead a business anywhere in the world if you are one of those apologetic characters. It just doesn't work.
Marketers, advertisers, it's always difficult to convince them, particularly with a new media startup. You've seen them yourself, no doubt. You have people that are seeing them on your behalf. Has that been difficult? How do you convince them that you've got something different to everybody else?
We've been very blessed in terms of the reception that Power received from both media, from talent, from the trade. And I think the advertising world as well has been more positive. I mean, when we launched Capricorn FM 5 years ago, it was tough. It took us a good 2 years to convince banks and telcos to advertise with us, with the exception of one. Our first advertiser was a bank on day one. By the first 2 weeks, all but one bank, advertising with us. All the telcos are on Power. FMCGs coming quite quickly. Had 2 cars. Automotive brands advertising on Power, and those are some of the categories that Jeremy, are very hard to convince.
But you got to keep them coming back.
You have to keep them coming back, and they have to see value. And even more so difficult now that we don't have the numbers yet, but also there's a science behind it. I mean, you just only have to look at the Twitter followers of Power. It surpassed 15, 16-year-old radio stations. You look at the unique page visitors. The largest one before Power was a national commercial radio station with about 100,000 visitors. Power averages 295,000 visitors on its website a month. So there's some indicative science before the ramps. It's got to be based on science. The proposition is going to be right, but what we've been selling most importantly is environment, and that environment backed up by the quality of people who are on the station.
Given Mkhari, thank you very much.
Thank you.